The morning came gray and unforgiving, pressing down on everything beneath it. Lucas Hale knelt before the simple granite headstone in Millbrook Cemetery, his knees sinking into cold earth. For 14 months he had come here every Sunday without shedding a tear, holding it together for Elsie, for the neighbors who still brought casseroles. But today something cracked. His shoulders shook as the first sob tore through him, raw and uncontrolled. Behind him, 7-year-old Elsie stood still, her small fingers clutching his jacket, trembling. Neither noticed the young woman 30 yards away, her black coat blending into fog. She placed white lilies beside a weathered headstone, glanced once toward them, then walked away in silence. 3 days later, Lucas returned to the cemetery alone during his lunch break from the hardware store. He needed to replace the flowers that had wilted in the cold, a small ritual that gave structure to his grief when everything else felt shapeless and uncertain. The cemetery was quiet at midday, empty except for crows gathered in the bare oak trees along the iron fence. As he approached Hannah's grave, he stopped short. The young woman from before was there again, standing a respectful distance from the headstone, her head bowed slightly, as if in private conversation with someone only she could hear. She wore the same understated black coat, her dark hair pulled back in a simple knot. When she heard his footsteps on the gravel path, she turned, and their eyes met properly for the first time. She was younger than he had thought, perhaps early 30s, with a face that carried a quiet seriousness that seemed at odds with her age. There was something in her expression he could not name, something between apology and recognition, as if she had been expecting this encounter while dreading it. She took a deliberate step back, creating distance between herself and the grave. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice low and even, carrying no trace of the false brightness people often used around grief. "I didn't mean to intrude on your time here." Lucas felt his defenses rise instinctively, the way they always did when strangers showed too much interest in his loss. He had grown weary of pity, of the way people looked at him with that mixture of sympathy and relief. "Did you know my wife?" The question came out sharper than intended, edged with the protective hostility of a man who had grown tired of explaining his grief. The woman hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I knew of her. She helped me once, a long time ago when I was just starting out. She was a night nurse at the hospital where I was a patient, and she showed me a kindness I never forgot. I never got the chance to thank her properly while she was alive, so I come here sometimes to pay my respects." Before Lucas could respond, the crunch of small footsteps announced Elsie's arrival. She had followed him from the car again, as she often did when she sensed he needed watching over. The little girl appeared at the edge of the path, her red mittens bright against the gray morning. "Who are you?" Elsie asked the stranger directly. "How did you know my mom?" The woman crouched down to Elsie's level, meeting the child's gaze with a seriousness that honored the question. "Your mother was a nurse, a very good one. She took care of someone I cared about very much, and she was kind when kindness was hard to find." Elsie considered this for a moment, her small brow furrowed with concentration. Then she nodded. "My mom was really nice. Everyone says so." The woman stood and stepped back, clearly preparing to leave. She offered no business card, no phone number, no suggestion of future contact. "I won't take any more of your time," she said to Lucas. "I just wanted to pay my respects. I hope I haven't made things more difficult." She walked away down the gravel path without waiting for a response, disappearing around the bend toward the parking lot. Lucas watched her go, a strange uneasiness settling in his chest. There was something about the encounter that felt unfinished, like the first chapter of a book left open on a table, waiting to be continued. 2 weeks passed before Lucas saw the woman again. The days had grown shorter and colder, and the town of Millbrook had begun hanging Christmas lights that felt more desperate than festive. Lucas had taken Elsie to Margie's Diner on Main Street, their Saturday morning tradition since Hannah's death. The routine helped both of them, gave Elsie something predictable to hold on to in a world that had become frighteningly unpredictable. They were seated in their usual booth by the window, Elsie, working on a coloring page the waitress had provided, while Lucas stared into his coffee and tried to calculate whether he could afford to buy his daughter a Christmas present this year. The woman walked in alone, shaking rain from an umbrella that had seen better days. She did not notice them at first, sliding into a corner booth with a folded newspaper and ordering coffee without looking at the menu. She wore jeans and a simple gray sweater, nothing that suggested wealth or status. It was Elsie who spotted her, tugging on her father's sleeve with quiet insistence. "Daddy, that's the lady from the cemetery, the one who knew Mommy." Before Lucas could decide what to do, Elsie had already slipped out of the booth and was walking toward the stranger's table with fearless determination. By the time Lucas caught up, Elsie had planted herself across from the woman. "You're
"The lady from the cemetery," Elsie announced. "You knew my mom. You said she was kind." The woman looked up from her newspaper, surprise flickering across her features, before settling into something warmer. "I did say that, and I meant it. You must be Elsie. Your mother talked about you sometimes during those late nights when neither of us could sleep." She glanced at Lucas. "Please sit down if you'd like. I promise I'm not following you. This is just the only diner in town that makes decent coffee." Lucas hesitated, then slid into the booth beside his daughter. "I'm Lucas Hale. I don't think we properly introduced ourselves." The woman shook his hand. "Naomi, just the first name, nothing more." They talked for nearly an hour while their coffee grew cold. Naomi asked Elsie about school, and the little girl's face clouded over. She was transferring to a new school after Christmas from the private academy Hannah had insisted on to the public school. The tuition had become impossible after Hannah's medical bills consumed their savings, and Lucas had been forced to make choices that felt like small betrayals. Naomi listened without judgment as Elsie described her fears about making new friends and fitting in at a school where everyone else had known each other since kindergarten. When Elsie finished, Naomi spoke carefully. "There's a community scholarship program for students transferring between schools. It covers supplies, tutoring, support, even enrichment activities. I could get you the information if you're interested. No pressure, no obligation." Lucas felt the familiar bristle of pride, the automatic resistance to anything that felt like charity. But he looked at Elsie's hopeful face and forced himself to nod. "That would be helpful. Thank you." Naomi wrote down a phone number on a napkin and slid it across the table. "Call that number and mention my name. They'll take care of the rest." She did not explain who they were or why her name would carry weight. She simply paid for her coffee, said goodbye to Elsie with a gentle smile, and left the diner without looking back. Lucas stared at the napkin in his hand for a long time after she was gone, the 10 digits that represented help he had not asked for from a woman whose last name he did not even know. The answer came 3 nights later, delivered with the casual indifference of local television news. Lucas was folding laundry in the living room, half watching the 11 o'clock broadcast while Elsie slept upstairs, when the business segment caught his attention. The anchor was discussing regional technology companies, and suddenly Naomi's face filled the screen. She was photographed at some kind of conference, dressed in understated business attire that suggested wealth while refusing to flaunt it. The chyron beneath her image delivered the truth in neat white letters. Naomi Sterling, founder and CEO, Sterling Systems, youngest self-made female billionaire in state history. Lucas stopped folding, a child's sock frozen in his hand as the reporter described how Sterling Systems had revolutionized financial software for small businesses across the Midwest. The company had been founded just 8 years ago in a basement office, and now it employed over 2,000 people with a market valuation that made Lucas's head spin. Naomi Sterling's personal net worth was estimated at $1.2 billion, a number so large it felt fictional, impossible to connect to the woman who had ordered coffee at Margie's diner without looking at the menu. The reporter went on to describe her reputation for privacy, how she rarely gave interviews and had never married, how she donated millions to charity but refused to have buildings named after her. She was described as reclusive but respected, brilliant but mysterious, the kind of success story that the business press loved precisely because she refused to cooperate with their narratives. Lucas sat on the edge of the couch long after the segment ended and the news moved on to weather forecasts. His mind raced back through every interaction with Naomi, re-examining each word and gesture through this new and distorting lens. the simple black coat that now seemed like a costume designed to make her appear ordinary, the plain sedan in the cemetery parking lot that he now realized was deliberately nondescript, chosen to avoid attention, the way she had offered the scholarship information as if it were nothing special, as if she were not the person who had probably funded the entire program in the first place. Everything felt different now, recolored by the knowledge of who she really was. The kindness that had seemed genuine now felt calculated. The modesty that had charmed him now seemed like an elaborate performance designed to make her billions more palatable to ordinary people. He had allowed a stranger into his grief, had let his daughter grow attached to someone who existed in a world so far removed from their own that the distance might as well be measured in light years. The shame of it burned in his chest like acid. He had needed help, and she had seen that need. And now he could not escape the feeling that he had been reduced to a project, a charitable endeavor, a feel-good story that Naomi Sterling could tell at dinner parties attended by people whose names appeared on buildings. The poor widower and his sweet little daughter, saved by the benevolent billionaire. It made him sick to think of it.
About it. The next morning, Lucas called the phone number Naomi had given him, but not to pursue the scholarship. He left a message declining any further assistance, keeping his voice neutral and his reasons vague. It was not their kind of help, he said. They would manage on their own. They had managed before, and they would manage again. When Elsie asked why they were not following up on the program that would have helped her at her new school, Lucas could not explain his reasoning in terms that a 7-year-old could understand. How could he tell her that pride had become more important than practicality? How could he admit that he would rather struggle alone than accept help from someone whose generosity felt like an accusation of his own failure? He simply told her that they would figure out another way, and he tried not to notice the disappointment that clouded her eyes. 2 days after his phone call, Naomi appeared at the hardware store where Lucas worked 3 afternoons a week. She found him in the paint aisle, restocking shelves with pans of exterior white that no one would buy until spring, a task so mindless that it left too much room for thinking. She stood at the end of the aisle for a moment before he noticed her, giving him time to register her presence before she approached. When their eyes met, she walked toward him with the same deliberate calm she had shown at the cemetery. "You called and declined the scholarship," she said without preamble, her voice carrying no accusation, but also no apology. "I think I deserve to know why, given that I went to some trouble to make the introduction." Lucas set down the can of paint he had been shelving and faced her, his jaw tight with the effort of controlling his response. "Because I know who you are now. I saw you on the news." Naomi's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, a flicker of something that might have been disappointment or resignation or simply exhaustion. "And that changes things? How, exactly?" Lucas felt his patience snap, the careful control he had been maintaining finally giving way. "It changes everything. You're a billionaire playing at being normal, driving around in a cheap car and pretending you're just some regular person who happened to know my wife, and I'm the struggling widower. You get to feel good about helping, the poor single father who can't afford to send his daughter to a decent school. I won't be someone's project. I won't be your charity case." The words came out harder than he had intended, sharp enough to wound, but he did not take them back. He had spent too many months accepting pity from people who did not know his name, and he was finished being grateful for scraps. Naomi was silent for a long moment after he finished, her gaze steady on his face, as if she were reading something written there that he himself could not see. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "You think my money means my kindness isn't genuine, that having wealth disqualifies me from real human connection. That's your assumption, Lucas. It's not my reality." She did not raise her voice, did not defend herself with the passion he had expected, did not try to convince him that he was wrong. She simply stated the fact and let it stand between them like a door she refused to close. "I came to your wife's grave because she helped me when I needed it most. I offered the scholarship because your daughter reminded me of myself at that age, scared and trying to be brave in a world that felt too big. If you want to interpret that as charity or pity or some kind of manipulation, that's your choice, but it says more about your assumptions than it does about my intentions."
She turned and walked away before he could respond, her footsteps echoing on the concrete floor of the hardware store until the automatic doors swished closed behind her. Lucas stood alone in the paint aisle, surrounded by cans of colors no one was buying, and wondered if he had just made a terrible mistake. He replayed her words in his head, searching for the manipulation he had been so certain was there. He found nothing but honesty delivered without defense. What he did not know was that Elsie had followed Naomi into the store, curious about the nice lady from the cemetery. His daughter had been standing at the end of the aisle the entire time, watching the exchange with eyes that understood more than either adult had realized. In the days that followed, Lucas made a deliberate effort to close the door he had accidentally opened. He did not return Naomi's calls when her number appeared on his phone, did not respond to the information packet about the scholarship program that arrived in the mail with no return address. When Elsie asked about the nice lady from the cemetery, Lucas changed the subject with the practiced deflection of a parent protecting his child from complicated truths. Naomi, for her part, did not push back against his withdrawal. She did not show up at the hardware store again, did not send representatives to plead her case. She simply disappeared from his life as cleanly as she had entered it, leaving only the memory of conversations that now felt incomplete. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing day, weighted with all the things that had been left unsaid. Lucas buried himself in work, picking up extra shifts at the store and taking on odd jobs around town to cover the gap left by the declined scholarship. He learned from a coworker that
the community scholarship program was real and well regarded, that families all over the county had benefited from it for years. When Lucas asked who funded the program, the coworker shrugged and said it was some anonymous donor who preferred to keep their name out of the publicity. This information only deepened his confusion. Naomi did not fit neatly into the narrative he had constructed about billionaires and their motivations. But admitting he might be wrong meant admitting he had pushed away someone who had only been trying to help. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source. One December evening, as Lucas was preparing dinner, Elsie appeared in the doorway holding a stack of papers she had retrieved from the box of Hannah's old things in the attic. Lucas had not touched that box since the funeral. "Daddy, who is Naomi Sterling? I found letters from her to Mommy, a lot of them." Lucas felt his stomach drop as he took the papers from his daughter's hands. There were at least a dozen letters carefully preserved in their original envelopes, dated over a span of 5 years. He sat down at the kitchen table and began to read. The correspondence told a story Lucas had never known. 6 years ago, during the early days of Sterling Systems, Naomi had been hospitalized for exhaustion. The company was teetering between success and collapse, and Hannah had been assigned as her night nurse during a 2-week stay. According to the letters, Naomi had been facing a terrible decision. A major investor had offered funding with conditions that would have required compromising her company's ethical principles. She had been on the verge of accepting, telling herself that survival justified the compromise. Hannah had spent those late nights talking with her, not as nurse to patient, but as one human being to another. And on the night before Naomi was to make her final decision, Hannah had said something that changed everything. "Your integrity is the only thing they cannot take from you. Everything else can be rebuilt, but once you trade away who you are, you never get that back." Naomi had declined the investor's offer the next morning. The letters showed that she had never forgotten Hannah's words. She had tried to thank Hannah over the years, but Hannah had always declined, saying she was just doing her job, that any good nurse would have done the same. But what she did was more than nursing. She gave her back herself when she was about to trade it away for money and convenience. I've never forgotten that. I never will. For the first time, Lucas allowed himself to see Naomi not as a billionaire or a stranger or a potential threat to his independence, but as a human being, carrying her own weight of grief and gratitude. She was not so different from him. Not really. They had both lost people who had defined them, and they were both still trying to figure out how to live in the spaces that loss had created. "I'm sorry," Lucas said. The words inadequate but necessary. "For what I said at the hardware store, for assuming I understood your motives when I didn't know anything about you.
You were trying to honor my wife's memory, and I threw it back in your face because I was too proud to accept help." Naomi turned to face him fully, her expression softer than she had ever seen it, her careful composure giving way to something more vulnerable. "You were protecting yourself and your daughter. I understand that instinct better than you might imagine. When you have money, everyone wants something from you, and you learn to assume the worst about people's intentions. I just wish you had given me the chance to explain before you decided I was the enemy." They walked together back toward the parking lot, the conversation flowing more easily now that the walls between them had begun to crack. Naomi spoke about the loneliness of success, how the money had come at the cost of relationships that could not survive the scrutiny. People treated her differently once they knew, either fawning over her or resenting her for having what they did not. Lucas spoke about the isolation of grief, how losing Hannah had made him defensive against any connection that might lead to more loss. He had built walls around himself and Elsie, walls that kept pain out but also kept everything else at bay. Neither of them offered solutions or empty reassurances. They simply acknowledged what was true and allowed that acknowledgement to be enough. The night Elsie got sick changed something fundamental between Lucas and Naomi. It was nothing serious in the end, just a fever that spiked unexpectedly high, the kind of childhood illness that terrifies parents out of proportion to its actual danger. But in the panic of the moment, Lucas's mind went to the darkest places a parent's mind can go. He had already lost Hannah to illness. The thought of losing Elsie to something that had seemed minor was more than he could bear. They spent the night in the emergency room at the regional hospital, Lucas holding Elsie's hand while doctors ran tests and administered fluids. By midnight, the fever had broken, and Elsie was sleeping peacefully in the hospital bed. Her small face relaxed in a way that made her look even younger than her 7 years. Lucas sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Elsie's bed, too exhausted to sleep, but too grateful to leave. He did not remember calling Naomi, but somehow she was there, appearing in the doorway around 2 a.m, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the same simple black coat she had worn at the cemetery. She did not ask permission to enter. She simply handed Lucas one of the coffees, sat down in the chair on the other side of Elsie's bed, and stayed. They barely spoke during those early morning hours, but the silence between them was different now, companionable rather than tense. Naomi did not try to fix anything or tell Lucas that everything would be fine. She simply sat with him in his fear, bearing witness to the vigil in the way that mattered most. When Elsie woke briefly around 4 a.m, disoriented and thirsty, she saw Naomi and smiled with a recognition that surprised Lucas. "You came," the little girl said, her voice scratchy from sleep. Naomi leaned forward and gently brushed a strand of hair from Elsie's forehead. "Of course I came, sweetheart. Your daddy needed company, and I was awake anyway." Elsie accepted this explanation with the straightforward logic of childhood, then drifted back to sleep with her hand reaching toward Naomi's. In those quiet hours before dawn, Lucas watched Naomi interact with his daughter and saw something he had somehow missed in all their previous encounters. Her warmth was genuine, unconnected to her wealth or status or any agenda he had imagined. She spoke to Elsie the way Hannah used to speak to patients, with a gentleness that expected nothing in return. And when the first gray light of morning began to filter through the hospital windows, Naomi shared something she told Lucas she had never admitted to anyone else. "The cemetery is the only place I can exist without being Naomi Sterling, the billionaire," she said softly, her eyes on the sleeping child rather than on him. "Everywhere else, people see the money first. They see what I can do for them, or what they think I owe them, or how they can benefit from knowing me. But at my mother's grave, I'm just a daughter who misses her mom. And standing near your wife's grave, next to someone else who's lost the most important person in their world, I can just be a person. Does that make sense?" Lucas understood then, in a way he had resisted understanding before, that Naomi's wealth had not protected her from loneliness or grief any more than his poverty had protected him. They were both navigating loss with imperfect tools, both trying to find solid ground in landscapes that kept shifting beneath their feet. The money that separated them in so many ways was irrelevant in this hospital room, irrelevant in the face of what they had each lost and what they were both still learning to carry. Winter deepened over the following weeks, and with it came a decision that Lucas had not anticipated having to make.
Naomi's responsibilities at Sterling Systems were demanding her return to the city, and she could not continue managing the company remotely from Millbrook. The distance would end whatever tentative connection had begun to form, unless something changed. She came to Lucas's house on a cold January evening after Elsie had gone to bed, and sat across from him at the kitchen table where he had first read Hannah's letters. She had a proposal, she said, and she wanted him to hear it fully before making any decision. Sterling Systems was expanding its community outreach division, building partnerships with small towns and rural areas that were often overlooked by technology companies. There was a position opening that seemed almost designed for someone with Lucas's skills and background, work that involved connecting with local businesses and understanding their needs. The salary would be more than double what he currently earned cobbling together part-time jobs. The benefits would include health insurance
and educational support for Elsie. It was not charity, Naomi emphasized. It was a job that needed doing, and Lucas was qualified to do it. The fact that it also solved his immediate financial problems was a bonus, not a primary motivation. Lucas listened to the entire proposal without interrupting, his coffee growing cold in his hands while his mind churned through implications and possibilities. The opportunity was real and generous, but accepting it meant leaving behind the life he had built around Hannah's memory. Every street in Millbrook held echoes of her presence. Every corner of their small house contained traces of the life they had shared. To leave felt like abandoning her all over again, like closing a chapter he was not ready to finish. He told Naomi he needed time to think, and she gave it without pressure, without any suggestion that the offer had an expiration date. She simply nodded and said she understood. For nearly 2 weeks, Lucas wrestled with the choice in front of him. He walked through Millbrook's quiet streets in the early morning hours, past the library where Hannah had volunteered, past the park where they had brought Elsie on summer evenings, past the church where they had married. The town was saturated with her memory, and part of him wanted to drown in it forever, to keep faith with their shared past. But another part of him, the part that had kept going through 14 months of grief, understood that standing still was its own kind of betrayal. Hannah had never been someone who clung to the past. She had always been looking forward, planning, dreaming. She would not have wanted him to spend his life as a monument to her absence. It was Elsie who finally helped him find clarity. She found him sitting on the back porch one evening, staring at the garden that Hannah had once filled with flowers. The little girl climbed into his lap with the easy trust of a child who had never doubted her father's strength. "Daddy," she said, her voice small but certain, "do you think Mommy would want us to be sad forever? Or do you think she would want us to try being happy again?" The question was so simple and so devastating that Lucas could not answer for a long moment. He held his daughter and felt the familiar ache in his chest, the grief that had become part of him. But alongside the grief, he felt something else, something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. He felt hope. "I think Mommy would want us to be brave," he finally said, "even when being brave feels impossible." Elsie nodded seriously. "Then maybe we should be brave, Daddy." On a cold December morning, 2 days before Christmas, Lucas and Elsie returned to Hannah's grave for what felt like a different kind of visit. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks, a pale winter blue that seemed to promise something beyond the gray that had dominated so many months. Naomi met them at the cemetery entrance, standing slightly apart from father and daughter as they walked together toward the headstone that had become so familiar. She understood without being told that this was their moment, their goodbye, and she was there only as a witness, not a participant. Lucas knelt before the granite marker, but this time he did not cry. Instead, he spoke to his wife as if she could hear him, telling her about the decision he had made, the life he was choosing to build, the man he was trying to become. "I'm not leaving you," he said quietly, his hand resting on the cold stone. "I could never leave you. I'm just learning how to carry you with me instead of staying in one place. You taught me that love doesn't stop when someone dies. It just changes shape, becomes something you hold inside instead of something you can touch." Elsie added her own words, a child's prayer that was equal parts heartbreaking and hopeful. She told her mother about the new school she would attend, about the adventures she planned to have, about the promise she was making to be brave enough for both of them. When she finished, she kissed her mittened hand and pressed it against the headstone, a gesture so tender that it made even Naomi's eyes sting with tears. Then Naomi stepped forward, carrying a bouquet of white lilies identical to the ones she had placed on this grave so many months ago. She set them gently at the base of the headstone, but this time she did something different. She pulled a small card from her pocket and tucked it among the flowers, where it would be visible. Lucas glimpsed the handwriting as she withdrew her hand. The card was simple, bearing only a few words. "Thank you, Hannah, for everything. With love, Naomi Sterling." It was the first time she had signed her complete name to the flowers she left at this grave, the first time she had claimed her complete identity in this place she had always used as a refuge from it. The gesture meant more than Lucas could articulate, a declaration that she was no longer hiding, no longer separating the woman she was from the woman the world saw. In this place of endings and remembrance, she was finally allowing herself to be whole. The three of them stood together in silence for a long moment, united by their connection to the woman whose headstone bore witness to their gathering. The winter wind stirred the bare branches of the oak trees that lined the cemetery fence, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to morning services. Lucas reached out and took Elsie's hand in one of his.
Without a moment's hesitation, he took Naomi's hand in the other. They stood that way as the bells faded into silence. Three people bound together by loss and gratitude and the tentative hope of something new. When they finally turned to leave, Lucas did not look back at the headstone. He did not need to. Hannah was no longer trapped in that place of stone and earth. She lived now in the lessons she had taught, in the kindness she had shown, in the courage she had given to a stranger who had become something more. She lived in the daughter who carried her smile and her stubbornness and her unshakable belief that the world could be better than it was. She lived, and that was enough.